In this lecture, we're going to look at kind of the evolution of populations. So not the best stylus for me, but it's what causes evolutionary change. Wow, this is not good. I use my finger here. It's just going to be not the best. We'll make it work. So what causes evolutionary change? It's the big focus in this half of the lecture. So organisms typically show individual variation. If you think about all the students in our class, each one of us looks a little bit different. Okay? However, on the origin of species, Darwin could not explain the cause of variation among individuals or how variations were passed from parents to offspring. So basically, he didn't know the genetics part of things. Just wasn't something he knew when he started this whole deal. So just a few years after the publication of The Origin of Species, then Gregor Mendel, remember that's our pea plants guy, wrote a groundbreaking paper on the inheritance in pea plants. So we had that last semester when we talked about genetics. Although the significance of Mendel's work was not recognized during his or Darwin's lifetime, its rediscovery in about 1900 set the stage for understanding the genetic differences on which evolution is based. So this is from our perspective here. So each person has a unique genome reflected in the individual phenotypic variations. Remember, this is our physical appearance kind of variations. That's our appearance, maybe some other traits, maybe not always some things we can see, but particular enzyme shapes or blood type, whatever, but that's still the outward expression. So indeed, individual variation occurs in all species. Variation is in everything. So here are a group of snakes, and you can see some of the individual variation among the different snakes, different banding patterns, and kind of little blotches are different. So some things that go into this is that we've got mutations here. So mutations in evolution are just changes in the nucleotide sequence of the DNA. That's our actual kind of definition, just to keep it simple. Can't write with my finger here either. But mutations in evolution, as far as they go, is really the ultimate source of new alleles. I'm going to try my best, but it sounds like I'm not having a good talking day. So we're going to make our way through this lecture as best we can. Okay. Mutations, as far as evolution are concerned, are the ultimate source of new alleles. We get new variation, so kind of types and patterns and things that we wouldn't necessarily have before, that comes from mutations. So mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as the raw material for evolution. That's much better than I can put it. And that's a key term. So on rare occasions, though, a mutated allele may actually improve the adaptation of an individual to the environment and enhance its reproductive success. So if we have, essentially it's like a beneficial mutation. If we have a beneficial mutation, well, then we're actually improving it, and so that's what's kind of driving evolution in that sense. So the big key term here is, so I'm going to kind of highlight the top here, is that evolution occurs within populations. That's one of the points that if I didn't make it clearly, I'm going to make it as clearly as possible throughout this whole section on evolution, is that evolution occurs at the population level. So a population is a group of individuals with the same species, live in the same area, and interbreed. So evolution can work on the population level. It cannot work on the individual level. So not on individual level. Okay, so definitely not that way. So we can measure evolution as a change in the prevalence of certain heritable traits in a population over the span of generations. So it's just that change in certain heritable traits in a population over time. Okay, we're still getting at the basic thing, and it's change over time. A gene pool consists of all copies of every type of allele at every locus, so at every place that those alleles, those genes live, and all members of the population. Okay, so that's everything there. Microevolution, so micro is little or small. So this is a small, on the small scale. So this is the change in the relative frequencies of alleles in a population over a number of generations. And this is evolution occurring on the smallest scale. So alleles, we're looking at, think back maybe to purple and white flowers, but if we have purple flowers, maybe that's their genotype. Maybe this is their genotype. Or if we have white flowers, this is the genotype, little p. So these would be the allele frequencies. So if I have maybe my whole gene pool consists of, I don't know, it consists of 3 purple flowers and 1 white flower. It's a tiny gene pool here. This is my gene pool. These are all the members and all the alleles. That's all they're contributing for some reason. But the allele frequencies would say that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the big P, and I have 3 of the little p. So that's kind of the frequencies, how often these appear. And if there's any changes in those, then that's evolution on the small scale. Just so you get an idea of what we're talking about. So to understand how microevolution works, explain that a little bit further, let's first example a simple population which evolution is not occurring. So we're not having any evolution and the gene pool is not changing. Okay, so consider this is an expansion on what we're doing. Consider an imaginary population of iguanas, individuals that differ in web footing. So web footing is a single gene, non-webbed is big W, and web feet is little w. And I had a whole population there. But I think we can cover that just a little bit more when we get into our populations. Well, I've got an idea for this one. Instead of kind of stopping there, we'll come back to it. Okay, because there are some really good ones to look at. I realized I did cut that out just to save us some time so we could continue to move forward. But I love the evolution part of things. So ask me questions if you want to know. All right, so we're looking at 2, and again, this is still looking at what causes evolutionary change. We're just looking at evolutionary change on the little level. So there are 3 main causes of evolutionary change: natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. This is a key thing that you'll want to know. Little changes to evolution. So we get those in our kind of individual description. So natural selection is if individuals differ in their survival and reproductive success, natural selection will alter the frequencies. So if we go back to our little imaginary iguana population, individuals with webbed feet, little w, might actually survive better and produce more offspring because they're more efficient at swimming and catching food than individuals who don't have webbed feet. So they're at a selective advantage because they can produce more babies and they survive better. So little w might become more frequent in the population because we have more little w guys surviving. So that might change our population to be more webbed in the feet. Okay, so genetic equilibrium would be disturbed as the frequency of the little w allele increased in the gene pool from one generation to the next. So if we have an increased number of little w's in the gene pool, that's evolution. That's a little bit of change in that population over time. Genetic drift was the second thing that we mentioned, and genetic drift is really interesting. It's more of just kind of a random thing. This just kind of accounts for just the randomness that happens in the universe. So in a process called genetic drift, chance events can cause allele frequencies to fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next. So the smaller the population, the more impact genetic drift is likely to have. So if it's a big population, genetic drift maybe won't make a difference. But if it's a tiny population, it does tend to have a greater impact. So some examples, these are some examples of genetic drift, is we have some catastrophes like hurricanes, floods, fires. If they kill off large numbers of individuals, leaving a small surviving population, that's likely to have the same genetic makeup, or that's unlikely to have the same genetic makeup as the original population. This is that wording. Okay, so they're not likely to have the same genetic makeup. So that's genetic drift. It's a random thing that's made the population change. This is actually what we call the bottleneck effect. So it leads to a loss of genetic diversity when the population is reduced. So if we look at it, here's our original population. You can see maybe there's the same number of little purple marbles. Maybe marbles are little dudes and their color is what we're looking at. So our original population has about the same number of green marbles, and then we have just a couple of little yellow marbles in there, a couple of oddballs. Well, whenever we have this kind of catastrophic event, basically what it means is there's a hurricane, all of these die, it's great sadness in the universe. Okay, so all of those end up dying. It's very sad and tragic. Well, now our surviving population doesn't look like anything like our original population. We actually have far more purple marbles than we had in our original population. We have one green represented, so it's not the same representation that we had before. Our little yellow dudes aren't even represented there at all. So that's changed the population randomly due to just kind of that event. Okay, we'll come back to that later. One reason it's important to understand the bottleneck effect is that human activities like overhunting or habitat destruction can cause some severe bottlenecks to other species. So examples of species affected by bottleneck are the Florida panther, the African cheetah, and the greater prairie chicken. Which, just in case you wanted to see that little guy, he's on here. This is a greater prairie chicken. He's something. We'll keep it going here. This isn't so bad, and then we'll take a break here in just a second. But genetic drift can also be likely when a few individuals colonize an island or another habitat. That's what we call the founder effect. It's similar kind of to the bottleneck, but it's a few individuals go over and found a new establishment. So the smaller group, less likely the genetic makeup of the colonists, will represent the gene pool of the larger population they left. So the founder effect explains why relatively high frequency of certain inherited disorders among some human populations are established by a small number of colonists. So you can think about kind of if you like history and stuff like that, we had the colonists come over and found a new thing over here. Well, they didn't represent the population in Europe. Okay? So there you go. Let's take a break here. So if I can't even use words today. Take a break, pause, come back, and take a look at the video in just a minute. Okay, so we're still on kind of things that randomly might cause some issues. So these are our microevolution, are things that are affecting the gene pool. These are kind of mechanisms for it. So the last one's what we call gene flow. So allele frequencies in a population can also change as a result of gene flow, where populations may gain or lose allele when fertile individuals move in or out of the population, or gametes like pollen are transferred between populations. So gene flow actually tends to reduce the differences between populations. It's basically kind of like immigration, and the other one's actually immigration, but it's like when things move in or out of a population. That's basically all that is. So to counteract the lack of genetic diversity in the remaining Illinois greater prairie chickens, those goofy looking birds we just looked at, researchers add 271 birds from the neighboring states of Illinois populations, which successfully introduced new alleles. That strategy worked, the new alleles entered the population, and the egg hatching rate improved to more than 90%. So using some gene flow, we were actually able to save the goofy looking greater prairie chicken. So to sum these up, so genetic drift, gene flow, and mutations could each result in microevolution, evolution at a small level. But only by chance could these events improve a population's fit to its environment. So we add those in conjunction with natural selection. Only the genetic variation produced by mutation and sexual reproduction results from random events. The process of natural selection, in which some individuals are more likely than others to survive and reproduce, is not random. So some of these may be random, but these are not. Natural selection is not random. Because of this sorting, only natural selection consistently leads to adaptive evolution. So this is one of our key points here. Adaptations of organisms include many striking examples. So consider some of the features that make up the blue-footed boobies suited for the Galapagos Islands. The bird's large web feet are great flippers, and they help propel the bird through water at high speeds. Its body and bill are streamlined, so it minimizes friction as it dives from heights up to 24 meters into the shallow water below. To pull out this high-speed dive, once it hits the water, the booby uses its large tail as a brake. So it's a pretty cool little dude. He's streamlined for getting in and out of the water at high speeds. Okay. So let's take a closer look at natural selection. So the commonly used phrases, the struggle for existence, or my favorite, survival of the fittest, are misleading if we take them to mean direct competition between individuals. So I think survival of the fittest always sounds like the Hunger Games, but it is not, in fact, the Hunger Games. We're going to talk about it, okay? Reproductive success is generally more subtle and passive. It's not nearly as aggressive as the Hunger Games. You're not murdering each other over getting a bow and arrow so you can murder other people and survive. It's not that intense. Okay, so relative fitness is the contribution of individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. Okay, so if some can provide more offspring to the next generation, they're technically more fit than others. So natural selection can affect the distribution of phenotypes of a population. Although we just had a little break, this might be another good place to stop and take a break if you need to. These are probably my favorite sections. There's some really good examples here. So take a break, make sure that your stuff's in order, and then come back. All right, so we've got three types of selections: the stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. And you will have to know these because they are important. So we're going to talk about them, and they'll make more sense on the next one. But stabilizing selection favors intermediate phenotypes, so intermediate kind of appearances. Directional selection shifts the overall makeup of the population by acting against individuals at one of the extremes. It'll make sense when we look at it. And disruptive really favors both ends of the phenotypic range over the intermediates. So it's the opposite of stabilizing. So what that looks like, if we have a population of these mice, and here's their colors, and here's the relative frequencies. So there are a few little white mouse, there are a few little dark mouse, but there are more of the population of this kind of gray colored mouse. That's in the middle. This is what this kind of graph is saying. I've got a few white mice, a few dark mice, and then kind of like some of those, but a lot of these little dudes. That's a normal population distribution. That's why we might think of human height or something like that as well. So that's what we're looking at. For our other selections, we'd have stabilizing selection, which says that we're going to favor this particular mouse that's gray colored and in the middle. So we're losing some of the white mice and some of the dark mice. And we're just favoring these dudes. The best example I have of this one is actually with human birth weights. So now with medical advances, this probably is more like spread out and normalized. But in earlier times before medical intervention, it favored birth weights that were somewhere in the middle here. It was somewhere around like 8-9 pounds, because too large of babies have a problem coming out and can harm the mother and themselves. Too small of babies can, don't have enough growth to survive. So we favored babies in this kind of middle birth weight. Though medical advances have, like I said, probably widened this dude right back out, but nonetheless, that's the example. There's tons of directional selections, and we can talk about one of the prime examples of these, but it's saying that we're going to select more in favor of these guys. So maybe our darker mice. So let's say they're in a forest that's, let's say, kind of gray colored or kind of brownish colored. Well, that will favor the brown and gray colored mice, because out there in a dark forest, you can see this dude like crazy, and so a big bird will come down and eat it because it can see it. And so this is a directional selection because it's going to shift that population more towards one one side. So the really good example of this one that we'll talk about is kind of the peppered moth, how it shifted from a lighter population of moths to a darker population of moths. That's typically what you hear for the evolution examples. Lastly is the disruptive selection, which is one of my favorite ones. There's an example of this one, like I can't use one with mice at all, but the one that I know of is that, let's say that there's a normal distribution of, there are these beetles with little horns, so I'll put it right here, little horns, and there are these beetles with big horns. So those two things are actually favored and not the kind of middle horns, because what happens is the ladies actually like the bighorn males. They think it's pretty studly and attractive, and the females will tend to go towards male with big horns. However, the thing with giant horns for these beetles is that those giant horns impede brain space. So little beetle guys with little horns actually have big old brains. So they actually like maneuver through the ground and manage to find the females, and can, without showing himself to her, he can mate with the female and actually produce babies. So the two things that are actually favored are the males with giant horns, or males with no horns, but actual, like, some kind of brain capacity to find a female and seek her out and make it happen. So those two extremes are favored, but if you're kind of in the middle, it's like, okay, so you have middle-sized horns that are not very studly to a lady, and you have kind of like maybe middle-of-the-road mental capacity. Kind of sucks to be you in the middle. So it's favorable to be either with large horns or little horns. So honestly, that is the only example that I know of for disruptive selection that actually exists. There you go. There's an example for each. All right, so along with that, the last one's a good segue into sexual selection. So sexual selection is a form of natural selection in which individuals with certain characteristics are more likely than other individuals to obtain mates. So in many animals, males and females may have secondary sexual characteristics, noticeable difference not directly related to reproduction or survival. This is what we call sexual dimorphism. So sexual di is to, morph is form. So we have two forms based on sexes. So think of the male and the female peacock. They have two different kind of appearances. That's sexual dimorphism. So sexual selection happens because think like females like the males with like the better plumage or feathers on the back of them for males. Tons of great examples for sexual selection. A lot of females choosing males on that one. A lot of bird ones are funny though. Like females choose the weirdest crap in birds, mainly just because they're looking for characteristics that it's like, wow, he has these super long tail feathers, but it's like they're dragging him down and probably killing him. And it's like, yeah, but if he can survive and still fly with these crazy tail feathers, that's the dude bird I want. Like, birds make no sense. The sexual selection is going to be great though. But here's an example. So the female, this is clearly the female right here. This is obviously the male, and he is trying to show. So that's sexual selection. She's looking for super massive, awesome feathers. And this is a good example, like I said, of sexual dimorphism. The female and the male look very, very different. So in some species, individuals compete directly with members of the same sex for mates. So this is what we call intrasexual. So intra is kind of like within, inter is between. So if we have intrasexual selection, it means it's within the same sex. So most often it's males, and mostly males are fighting each other. So some physical combat or some kind of ritual displays to signify increased studliness over the other male. So that's what we call intersexual selection. So here's an example of two of these males fighting each other to prove that they are stronger males for a mate. A more commonly type of sexual selection is called intersexual selection. So it's between the sexes selection or mate choice. So individuals of one sex, usually females, are choosy and selecting their mates. Okay, so what is the advantage to females of being choosy? One hypothesis is that females prefer male traits that are correlated with good genes. So in several bird species, research has shown that traits preferred by females, like bright beaks or long tails, are related to overall male health. The good genes hypothesis was also tested in gray tree frogs, and female frogs prefer to mate with males that give long mating calls. So it's supposed to signify that he's in good health, you know, he can take care of babies, whatever it needs to be. So here's a little tree frog doing his little do-lappy thing. So those are lots of different types of selections there that we'll look at as we move forward. The last little bit here that we're going to talk about is how we have kind of an evolution connection. So one of the things we talked about a little bit is the evolution of drug-resistant microorganisms as far as a public health concern. So antibiotics are drugs that kill infectious microorganisms. During the 1950s, some medical experts even thought the age of human infectious diseases would be over. But why didn't that optimistic forecast come true? Because it didn't take into account the force of evolution. So what happened? All right, there we go. So in the same way that pesticides select for resistant insects, antibiotics select for resistant bacteria. So we see both the random and non-random aspects of natural selection. The random genetic mutations in bacteria that have this kind of genetic resistance, and then this non-random selective effects as the environment favors the antibiotic-resistant phenotype. So if you constantly pump in antibiotics, that constantly kind of puts a pressure. If there's a mutation where we have bacteria that are resistant, they're going to thrive, and they don't need a partner. Remember, that's kind of like binary fission that's happening. So if we have one, you can have many. So in what ways do we contribute to the problem of antibiotic resistance? Doctors overprescribe antibiotics. We were just all on a cruise and all had a cold. I was the only one not prescribed antibiotics because I didn't go to the doctor. I just took obnoxious amounts of Mucinex, good to go. But both my mom, my sister, and my sister's fiance were all prescribed antibiotics for a cold. It's a virus. We already know viruses don't do well with antibiotics. So this is just another example of an overprescription of antibiotics. Patients may misuse prescribed antibiotics by prematurely stopping the medication because they feel better. This is often why your doctor will tell you to take the full course of the antibiotics. We want to make sure we murder every single bacteria that's in there. All right. Livestock producers, too, will also add antibiotics to animal feed as a growth promoter and to prevent illness. So we're just sprinkling the antibiotics out there, and we don't necessarily give our immune system a chance to fight. And we give these pressures out there for things that are resistant to antibiotics to continue to thrive and do well. So each year in the U.S., nearly 100,000 people die from infections they contract in a hospital. The hospital is like the worst place. Often because the bacteria are resistant to multiple antibiotics. So an example is the superbug of MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. That's also known as the flesh-eating disease, and it can be potentially fatal if it reaches it into the bloodstream and becomes a whole-body infection. So it is resistant to all kinds of antibiotics. So MRSA is a tricky one. Here's an example of a MRSA case that's in a hand. That's a nice one. Like, there are uglier pictures. Okay. So with that, we're going to stop. That's it for this part of evolution. If you have any questions at all, feel free to shoot me an email, but we'll work our way through them and we'll ask some questions and see where we go with it.